Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 314 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new AMC series The Terror, based on the novel by Dan Simmons, who was our guest back in episode 96. And this will involve spoilers for all of Season 1, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Grady Hendrix, making his 13th appearance on the show. He's the author of such novels as Satan Loves You and My Best Friend's Exorcism, and his novel Horror Store, about a haunted IKEA, is being developed for television by Gail Berman, producer of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. His nonfiction book Paperbacks from Hell, about the horror boom of the 70s and 80s, is out now. So Grady, welcome to the show.
Aloha.
Then next...
You did that on purpose.
Then next up, we've got Erin Lindsay, making her 10th appearance on the show. She's the author of the Bloodbound series of epic fantasy novels from Ace, as well as the Nicholas Lenoir series of historical paranormal detective novels from Rock, which she writes under the name E.L. Tetensor. Her historical mystery Murder on Millionaire's Row will be published by Minotaur Books in October. So Erin, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Always great to be here.
And also joining us today is Sam J. Miller, who you may remember from our panel on Sense8 back in episode 157, our panel on Taboo back in episode 256, and our panel on cities in fantasy and science fiction back in episode 307. He's the author of the novels Blackfish City and The Art of Starving, and his short fiction appears in magazines such as Lightspeed, Nightmare, and Strange Horizons. His work has received the Andre Norton Award and the Shirley Jackson Award. So Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey.
Okay, and so I want to start off with Grady, because I know, Grady, that you've read the novel, The Terror, that this TV show is based on. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what are your impressions overall of the book?
Of the book is very long. It's a Dan Simmons book, so that goes with the territory. And it's one of those books that's good to read in the summer because it's super duper refrigerated. I mean, there's so many words for cold in this book, that you get that by proxy. It's not my favorite book. I really feel like it, for me at least, it totally goes off the rails at the end and gets very woo-woo mystical, which I didn't really like. I actually have to say, even though I hated the first few episodes of the show and thought I was really going to stop watching, I wound up liking the show a whole lot better than the book. It's still a good book. Lots of people love it. It's very, very carefully researched. And the only real criticism I think you can level at the book, besides, are we allowed to spoil the book as well?
I didn't give a spoiler warning for the book, so how about don't spoil the ending of the book if it's different from the
Well, I won't spoil the ending, but the relationship between Lady Silence and the Toonbach in the book involves the Toonbach picking her up, giving her mouth to mouth, and then playing her like a bagpipe by pushing air through her vocal cords. And I really appreciated that the TV show didn't go there. Also, the only real criticism beyond that you can level against the book is the book came out in the 90s, and it was a huge hit for Simmons. But a lot of discoveries have been made about the Franklin expedition since then, and so some of the stuff in the book and therefore the show have been sort of contradicted by some of the evidence they found later. But, that's no one's fault. The authors don't get time machines, unfortunately.
So unfair. I mean, I was actually planning to read the book in time for this panel, and I even ordered it, but then it came and I saw it was 800 pages long, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to have time to read that.
That's what I like about you, Dave, your determination.
But no, so I'm glad that you're here, Grady, you can fill us in on the differences between the book and the show. But yeah, so how about Erin? Just sort of what do you think about this? Overall impressions of the show? Actually, Grady said he didn't like the first few episodes. What do you think of the first few episodes?
Actually, I definitely, my ears pricked up when he said that, because I actually liked the first 2/3 of the show better than the final act. I think I liked the ending, which I imagine we'll get to in due course, but I thought the first two acts were stronger than the third act. But overall, I really liked the show. I thought it was wonderfully tense and creepy. I think the Arctic is a tremendous setting for this type of survival horror, because it really taps into some of those primordial fears that we have of, on the one hand, that tiny claustrophobic space of the ship, and on the other hand, this vast, harsh, alien landscape of the Arctic. And in certain ways, when I was watching it, I was like, it's kind of surprising that you don't see that as a setting more. We're quite familiar with the mountains, with the woods, and other kind of isolated environments. But the Arctic was really well used here, to the point where I thought this was a show that made as good or better use of its physical environment to create mood than many others. Sam, we were on the Taboo panel together, and that was another one where I thought the cinematography and the color palettes and all the rest of it went a long way towards creating mood, and I think they did a good job with that here. I also thought it was courageously slow moving, meaning, in comparison to a lot of shows, there's not a ton of action, particularly in some of those early episodes. But it felt appropriate to me, and I could sort of build on that later. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it.
That's interesting what you say about the Arctic setting, because that's true. But I imagine that it's just hard to film something that looks like it takes place in the Arctic, right? Because you basically can't film in the actual Arctic probably, and there's not a lot of locations on Earth that have these giant snowfields. I mean, it took a pretty big budget, I think, and a lot of special effects and stuff to set a whole show there.
That's probably true, and we made the terrible, terrible mistake of buying this show in SD instead of in HD, which usually isn't an issue, but I feel like the provider that we bought it from was just giving us the giant middle finger of like, oh, you want it in SD? Have you some pixels? So it was really, the Arctic environment was, when they were outdoors, was particularly scattered and weird looking. But one thing I thought I noticed was that in relatively few scenes did anyone have their breath fogging in the cold. And if it's like supposed to be -50, it was a huge thing for me. Where are the red noses and the sniffling and the running eyes and anyway. It's a nitpick.
I listened to an interview with the showrunners, and they talked about that as a factor, the fogging breath. But I can't say I actually noticed it in the show, although I wasn't paying super close attention.
I'm Canadian. This is the kind of thing. It's in my blood. I know what to look for.
Well, how about Sam? What did you think? Overall impressions of the show? Would you recommend it?
Well, first of all, I'm still stuck on Grady saying that we've had new evidence that contradicts some of the things that are in the book and in the show, and I just pray that doesn't include proving that there's no Tunbach, because I really, really want to believe that is real. And really, nothing you can say can tell me it's not. I really loved the show. I thought, similar to Taboo, it had this great feel of being about a period and representing it and sort of like looking at imperialism and like militaristic nationalism in a lens that sort of highlights how damaged that is and how much it damages individual men and their relationships. I have a real love-hate relationship with stories like this because, a bunch of dudes hanging out together, especially in a really militaristic setting, can get really, macho and boring. And if you think about a narrative like Moby Dick, which is sort of like about the intimacies between men and how, we can tell a queer story in a setting, in a world that's really hostile to them, that's one thing. But then often, in exploring the masculinity of a bunch of dudes, often you can give it a sort of aggrandizement or, glamorization, which this show didn't really do. I really, really loved, its sort of representations of the toxicity of the sort of mindset of these folks. I love the fact that actually the Tunbach gets sick from eating them. Like they're so fucked up. They're so flawed, and they're so full of horrible intentions and actions that eating them sickens it. And yes, later on they're being poisoned. There's physical poison involved that poisons it as well. But I love that it had historically accurate sodomy. Often when we're telling stories about naval life, it's like, oh yeah, and a bunch of dudes were on a ship together and they definitely were never fucking. And so, I love that there was some pretty solid representation of queerness. I think it was this is probably apocryphal, but they say that Winston Churchill was asked the secret of British naval supremacy, and he said rum, sodomy, and the lash. So there's a lot of all those those things in this show, so I choose to believe that it's accurate.
Well, can I make the... Oh, go ahead.
Actually, let me just... Well, yeah, I mean, I wonder if... I think that would be a good blurb for this show, for AMC to use for season 2, historically accurate sodomy. But no, I thought this... Actually, I guess there's not going to be a season 2 with these characters. So.
That's very optimistic of you, though.
But I thought this show was really terrific. I have some criticisms, but they're all relatively minor. But you were saying, Sam, about all the men, and one of my criticisms, and there was no getting around this, but the fact that pretty much every character is a grizzled white man bundled up in coats and furs meant that I really had a hard time distinguishing the characters a lot of the time.
Thank goodness it wasn't just us. We were like, can we get a ginger up in here? Somebody with freckles, for the love of God. Who's that again?
Yeah, and even Collins and Goodsir look very, very similar to each other. Just even granted that they're all white men and so on. But yeah, no, I like the show a lot. But so Grady, I can tell you're anxious to get back in here.
Oh no, I was just gonna say what Sam was saying. One thing that's really interesting is so all the way through the 2000s, remains and things have been found at the expedition, but there are 4 sets of human remains that were found, I think, in 2013 that were part of the crew. It's hard to tell which ship they were part of the crew on, but they didn't have Y chromosomes. And so it's really strong evidence that there might have been women disguised as men, at least 4 of them serving in the crew. Now, that did happen in the Royal Navy. There are accounts of that. It could also be that the DNA samples were so degraded, they couldn't find, they couldn't find the Y chromosomes, but there is evidence indicative that some of the crew members were disguised women.
Yeah, some of the research I did indicated that was relatively common for every ship to have a couple women,
right,
disguised as men. But I feel like we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yes, sorry.
So for people who haven't read the book, or maybe even haven't even watched the show and are just listening to this, let's talk about. Could you just set us up, Grady? What is the actual historical context that this show is riffing on?
So the historical context is Sir John Franklin's expedition to find the Northwest Passage. Arctic mania was huge in Britain in the 19th century. It was, in the 19th century, Britain's identity was about its navy and the strength of its navy, and always has been. But with sort of no more wars to fight, and everywhere had been colonized that they were interested in colonizing, the idea of exploring the North was really, really a huge national fascination. And so Sir John Franklin's expedition was one of many that went looking for the Northwest Passage, which was this rumored route above Canada, between the Arctic and Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Because to travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific at the time, you had to go around the tip of South America, and I think the Magellan Straits, which was really, really dangerous and time-consuming. So there was this idea if they could find a Northwest Passage, trade would just boom like a mofo. So lots of people went looking for it, and lots of people died looking for it. And Sir John Franklin seemed to vanish off the face of the earth. And it wasn't until a few years later that evidence of what had happened and the ships started to come up. But I think there was something like 29 or 30 expeditions that went out looking for Sir John Franklin's ships after he vanished, looking for the Northwest Passage. And while looking for him, they managed to map a lot of northern Canada and the North Atlantic and the Arctic and things. So a ton of information. He did a huge service to science by getting lost and dying. And the last thing I'll say about this is irony of ironies. While Crozier, who was the other captain, there was Sir John Franklin on the Erebus and Francis Crozier on, I don't think he was a Sir actually, I think he was just Francis Crozier on the Terror, while looking for them and while Crozier was still alive, a guy named Robert McClure actually found the Northwest Passage and became the first person to traverse it. But he came into it from the Pacific side rather than the Atlantic side, and he had to go on dog sled part of the way. So while Crozier was trying to breathe and survive and maybe breathing his last, someone actually found what they'd been looking for while looking for him.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that because I did a little bit of research, and Crozier was a really interesting character because he was not nobility. He was sort of middle bred or something. I think they say in the show, but he was super competent. He was the best, most experienced Arctic explorer at the time, and a lot of his expertise was not put to good use because they preferred to put power in the hands of people who were from better breeding and richer families who didn't really know what they were doing. So like this guy Fitzjames he staffed his whole ship with his Navy buddies from campaigns he had fought in the tropics. So the whole ship was all people who had no experience really in cold weather. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting historical stuff like that.
Do they mention on the show at all that Crozier was Catholic?
They mentioned that
he's Irish.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that was the thing that really held him back in his career, and why he was never titled is he was Catholic. And there was still a huge amount of anti-Catholic prejudice in Britain at the time.
I believe the word you're looking for is papist.
Yeah, the dirty, dirty papist.
I think there's some oblique references to it in the show, but so I feel like we can't talk about Canada so much without drawing on the expertise of our resident Canada expert here. So Aaron, what did you think about just kind of the historical, I know you're a fan of historical fiction. What did you think about the historical milieu that this show created?
I'm a big fan of historical fiction, and I'm especially a big fan of historical fiction with a sprinkling of the supernatural. So this show really hit the sweet spot for me. My main reaction was, shit, why didn't I come across this one first? But clearly I'm many years too late for that. It was interesting listening to Dan Simmons on a podcast that you referred us to, Dave, talking about, because it just very much resonated with how I went about the historical fiction that I just wrote, that you have a sense of, I want to set it in this type of place, I want to set it in this general time period, and then you go looking for something weird or unexplained that's just kind of begging to have a novelist fill in the blanks. And I think he really found a great story with the Franklin expedition, not least because there were so many gaps that needed filling in. And so that's really ripe. And I think they did a really good job of that. There are definitely some things, I haven't read the book. Listening to the podcast was interesting because there are definitely some criticisms, some of them relatively significant, that I have of the show that I wish they would have made some different choices. And it's interesting to hear how those problems really arise out of the source material, and the makers of the show were conscious of those blind spots or those potential points of friction and did their best to sand them down. Or to overcome them. And I didn't know any of that watching it, and I still had those criticisms. So to me, they obviously didn't repair the issue. They didn't address the issue. They didn't quite fix it. And we can go into more detail on what I mean by that down the line if you want, or we can do it now. But yeah, overall, I think it was really, really interesting. I think as much as I generally don't like to read extremely verbose tomes, I almost want to read this one in the sense that you lose a lot in the translation to screen in terms of the research. You lose a lot of, I think they did a very good job of creating atmosphere. They had a great use of sound with the howling wind and the creaking timbers and the crushing sound of the ice, and giving that sense of physical constant pressure and threat. But at the same time, I would have liked to hear those millions of ways of describing cold, or those millions of ways of describing the ice, and to learn more about sort of the anatomy of the ship that they can't sort of by definition do in a show, but I imagine he really geeked out on in the book.
All right, yeah, let's get to some of those concerns you mentioned a little bit later, but first I just want to set up, you mentioned that this is a supernatural story as well. And so, Sam, why don't you talk about that? What did you think of the fact that this was a historical / supernatural horror story?
I mean, they had me at historical / supernatural. I really loved that those elements of it. I thought they were really well done. I think that when you're reimagining the past, you're always going to be adding things that are you and your obsessions and fascinations. And so why not amazing, terrifying bear spirit? So I really love those. I feel like this just the setting alone set this show up to mine some really excellent horror territory, specifically The Thing, one of my favorite movies. And this idea of a bunch of dudes, most of them with beards, trapped in extreme isolation, stalked by something terrible that sort of brings out their own worst pieces and the worst parts of themselves, and struggling to survive both against a monster and an environment that are trying real hard and ultimately succeed in killing them. So yeah, I had some things that I felt kind of that I knew they were problematic, and some of them made me like uncomfortable, or in like that I kind of liked them even if they were kind of problematic. Like, I have a very complicated history with gay villains.
So that's one. Ding! Family Feud. That's the first one that comes up.
Yeah. So, I actually am not anti-gay villain. I will often, sort of my sort of coming of age as a queer person and seeing the only representation I would see would be like Dr. Frankenstein or Ursula the Sea Witch or any number of amazing queer villains. And so I can get down with that. I thought that Hickey, as much as he's a despicable character, I thought that I read him as a gay man, not just somebody who was having gay sex as a matter of that's the only way to have sex when you're with all dudes. So I kind of like that you could have a character that flawed and that complex and also gay. But yes, it's also feeds into problematic narratives, and I also am, there's levels on which I totally see a critique of that. There's definitely something to be said for not going that route.
Yeah.
Well, can I just throw something in real quick in defense of the gay villain of Hickey? Because I think also that was probably a misstep on the part of the showrunners. But there is room in history to say maybe everyone on the ship was gay. Like, sodomy and relationships between men was rife in the Victorian Navy in the 19th century. And most officers, except for the biggest prudes, in their memoirs and later in life in their letters, really remarked on it as it was pretty commonplace, and it really didn't bother anyone, and it seemed to go on almost all the time, and didn't raise many eyebrows. So yes. You could say that they're all gay.
You could.
Or at least for the purpose of the voyage.
And maybe you should have. And I think that raises kind of the issue. And I don't want to go too far down this path, because I think, like Sam, I think it could have been worse. I think I don't have any problem either in principle with a gay villain, but I think that there are ways that you kind of need to manage these things. And I think if you are starting out with the narrative that is, because of the setting that you've chosen and the story that you've chosen is of necessity almost overwhelmingly, almost exclusively white dudes, I think you need to bring that extra level of care to the diversity that you do represent. So that's one layer of it. Another layer of it was really interesting to listen to Dan Simmons on this podcast talking about how, in his mind, Hickey is not gay, nor is he just engaging in sexual activity with another man because that's all that's available to him. He's explicitly using sex as a means of manipulation. And in a certain way, I actually think it's a much better way of handling it. Either of those two things, like either they show that this is something that's rife on the ship, and it's not just Hickey and Gibson. It's not just, I don't remember the purser's name, but the nice old man who is sharing the literature and eventually becomes a doctor. That it is more pervasive than that, or showing that it's a conscious manipulation tactic on the part of our villain. Those actually make more sense to me than, I think, in trying to give the villain more depth and more well-rounded motivations and personality by actually making this a relationship as such. I think they're getting dangerously close to a negative stereotype that they should have been hyper acutely aware of in view of the fact that they started from a starting point of all white dudes.
Yeah, and I actually buy the argument. And I think, if you squint and look at it sideways, you see it on screen that Hickey is just using this to manipulate. But I agree that you kind of have to squint real hard and look at it sideways. They don't make that real obvious. And also, just before we move on from Hickey, I just wanted to say one thing I did really like about this show is mostly dudes. We don't know what gender the Tumbak is, if it has one. But I really liked that it explored or allowed there to be a whole range of emotional relationships between men. Whether it was, a father-son kind of relationship, a relationship between equals, like what formed between Crozier and Fitzjames towards the end, a relationship of sort of an intimate friendship. I was never quite sure if the dude who becomes the doctor had a sexual relationship with the younger guy he shared literature with or didn't, but they clearly had what I think was a intimate friendship, was I think what the term is used. And that there was a range of everything from sexual relationships to manipulative relationships to real intense, almost romantic relationships that were just intense friendship. And you don't see that a whole lot. And that's one thing I really appreciated on this.
Interesting. Okay, so if you're listening to this and you haven't watched the show and you're feeling a little lost. So you have these two ships and they get stuck in the ice in the Arctic. And the crew starts to realize that there's this, as Sam was saying, a sort of bear monster spirit that's linked to the local Inuit culture, that they sort of interact with it. And so in one of the early episodes, some men are out on the ice and they're afraid, and they believe that this bear, quote unquote, is chasing them, and they end up firing into the darkness and accidentally kill an Inuit man, who we understand is some type of shaman who's able to control this monster, and his daughter is then the sort of job of controlling it falls to her, and she is not able to, she says as he's dying, like, don't put this responsibility on me, I'm not ready, and she's not really able to control it, and so it starts killing the men of this expedition in a pretty expeditious fashion. And some of this, I was not entirely sure how much we were supposed to understand about the sort of quote unquote magic system or what was going on. But so the shaman has cut out his own tongue. Does anyone understand exactly what was going on with that? Is there more to understand there?
I mean, I have read more about what that's supposed to be, although I don't think that we were given a lot more in the show. And that is one of my nits to pick. Is that I would have liked to understand a lot more about the relationship between the Inuit in general, the Arctic in general, with the Tumbak, but specifically also the shamans. What I read, and Grady, you can correct me because you've read the book, but what I understood was that in the book anyway, that the Tumbak back in the day was this uncontrolled destructive spirit, and that the shamans are, rather than controlling it per se in the sense of a puppet, like I tell it to do something, they're almost of the seven seals kind of variety of magic. So there are 6 of these shaman, and together collectively they manage to keep the Tumbak from wreaking havoc, and they curb its worst tendencies. But the cutting out of the tongue is a ceremony where they offer the tongue to the Tumbak. And by consuming the tongue, the Tumbak acknowledges that they are one of the 6 shaman. Is that roughly right?
Yeah. I mean, the Tumbak's interesting because I'm not quite sure how much it's supposed to be an actual Inuit spirit, because there is something in Inuit religion like a Torngak, which is like a bad spirit, but it doesn't have a physical form. It's a little bit different. So I'm not sure how much of this is freewheeling and how much of this is based on anything real. But yeah, you're right. I mean, within the mythology of the book, there are the mute shaman who cut out their tongue. I mean, basically the Tungak was created to be a weapon of mass destruction and wipe out the gods. And they fought it for like 10,000 years or something. And finally they gave it this physical form and threw it down in the Arctic where it's not going to bug anyone. And then they're like, oh shit, the people who worship us live there. And it just runs around and eats them from time to time, the Inuit. And they've got the mute shaman who are able to negotiate with it, like you said, and direct it and redirect it and keep it sort of under control. And that the coming of the white man upsets this balance that they've worked out over the years between these 6 mute shaman and this Tungak, and that it, goes wild and starts eating everything. And then, like Sam said, in the book, they make this really clear that it eats so many white people, it gets sick and dies. And another place the book differs from the show is that at the end, Crozier does cut out his tongue and joins with Lady Silence to be a shaman controlling it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you're basically, that's it. Yeah.
So I actually have a quibble with the argument. I don't know, but I'm not entirely sure that she's completely unsuccessful in controlling it, because I have a theory. There's episode, I think 8, where she discovers where Hickey essentially and co murder that group of Inuit people after Hickey has stabbed other white dude whose name I can never remember's chest a bunch of times.
Irving.
Yeah. So she sees their corpses, and then later in the episode, while the Tunbak attacks Terror Camp, and just like slaughters everybody. And so I would love to believe that she's sort of behind that, and in her grief or anger, sort of made that happen, and that her failure in the end isn't necessarily that she couldn't control it, but that it died on her watch, as it were.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, Sam, because I had exactly the same reading of that as you did, that at least we're meant to question the extent to which she may or may not be directing the Tunbak in its actions. But in listening to this podcast, it sounds like the makers of the show thought it was really obvious that in that scene where she offers her tongue to the Tunbak, it rejects her. And I was like, well, I did not get that from that scene.
I didn't get that either. I thought it clearly, yeah.
I thought so too. I thought that they were bonded together. And that's one of many instances where I felt that they kind of underplayed their hand a little bit, that they could have been a little bit more explicit. And I say this as somebody who, generally speaking, when I'm having editorial discussions with my agent or my editor or whoever, they're the ones who are telling me it's too subtle. You need to play it up. And I always complain about beating people over the heads with things. But even coming from that sort of default position, I found a lot of this stuff was understated, too subtle, needed to be a little bit more explicit if it was important that we understood that Lady Silence did not have that level of control, that she was rejected by the Tunbak, then they should have made it more obvious that that was the case. But if I can go back to something that Grady said a minute ago, I'm not familiar with Inuit mythology at all, but based on just a little bit of research that I did prior to recording this show, it sounds as though the Tunbak, and listening to the podcast and listening to Dan Simmons talk about how he developed the monster, it sounds as though the Tunbak is not that directly drawn from Inuit mythology, but is rather kind of a pastiche of various different creatures and deities in Inuit mythology. And that kind of segues into the second, I think, uncomfortable issue with this. The other trope that they flirt with a little too closely for my liking is the exotic magical aboriginal. And I think they could have avoided that problem if they had grounded the Tunbak more explicitly, rather than have a pastiche of sort of vaguely gesturing in the direction of actual Inuit mythology, actually had it in an unedited way, drawing directly from Inuit mythology. Or at the very least, I would have liked the Tunbak to be fleshed out more as a character, more embedded in that mythology, so we really understand, to go back to what I was saying before, better how he fits in, understand his relationship to the shamans, understand his role in the landscape. Then at least you could say we're drawing from a real world tradition and a real world culture, as opposed to just picking up the lace and the frills from that culture and turning it into a gothic monster.
Okay, wait, just on the subject of what are we supposed to understand about how the Tunnbach actually just works? So there's a part where Lady Silence, who is the deceased shaman's daughter that I mentioned, so she says to Crozier, she says something like, "Why you want to kill yourself, you know what you have to do, and you don't do it," when he's asking her, how do we kill the Tunnbach? And I was just confused about what was going on there. Is there anything more to understand about what she was telling him he had to do there?
Was she talking about the Tunnbach, or was she talking more about his alcoholism?
I don't know. She says, you know what you have to do and you don't do it. And I'm opening the floor if anyone has any explanation.
Well, this is where I think I agree, where it's there's a dismaying tendency in these shows to have Aboriginal people speak in fortune cookies, and I think you could really interpret that dialogue in 9 billion different ways. Because she could be saying, "You've got to dry up and get sober to lead your men out." She could be saying, "You have to turn back and get out of here." She has to be saying, "You have to die." Like, we have no freaking clue, and it's sort of one of the problems where the Tunnbach becomes very undermotivated. I'm not sure, it's a physical thing that runs around and kills people because it's pissed off, it's hungry, it's been directed to, it kills white people, it kills Inuits. Like, it's really, and it's the same problem in the book a little bit. You never quite understand the Tunnbach and its rules, and it's sort of coming and going. It's like the asshole ex machina, It's like whenever we just need to kill a bunch of people by a total dick, we just drop in the Tunnbach.
Yeah, I had a question about while we're talking about the magic system. And Grady, maybe this is clarified in the book. What is up with Hickey knowing to offer his tongue to the Tunnbach?
Dude, I don't even, because he doesn't do that in the book.
Okay.
But you said Crozier does in the book.
In the book, Crozier does, but he does it as sort of this gesture of, because Lady Silence. So I'm going to just real quick, these guys go out over the ice right at the end, and they travel and they all die. And Lady Silence is cast out by her people because she's one of these shaman. And because the same way that Lady Silence was traveling with her father, the shaman, Crozier becomes the person traveling with Lady Silence, at least in the book. And you assume also to some extent in the show. And in the book, it's very clear he cuts out his tongue as a gesture of solidarity to continue, like, to say, I'll stand by you to her.
Right. I think, it's interesting what you're saying about the Tunnbach being undermotivated. In a certain sense, it's one of the things I appreciated about the creature. I don't know if it was necessarily intentional or if I'm overthinking it, but the Tunnbach is in some ways an excellent metaphor for the environment in which they find themselves. This new world that's so frightening and alien to the men. The creature, it's mysterious. They don't understand its nature, but it's dangerous and they're terrified of it. It's destroying them, and yet they're also destroying it. So they're this insidious infection that's contaminating and killing the Tunnbach slowly. And so it really is kind of a good metaphor for that environment into which they've come. And so the fact that it's a bit inscrutable doesn't bother me so much. The other thing that I appreciated about it is I think that they were they used a relatively judicious hand in when they deployed the monster. Mm-hmm. And they talked about this on the podcast. And I had also noticed that it is a bit ex machina, but they also don't. I think there probably would have been a strong temptation, if not outright pressure, to, especially in a narrative that is, by a lot of conventional standards, quite slow, to introduce the Tunnbach anytime the narrative felt like it was slumping. And they're like, we need to kill a bunch of people, enter ravenous polar bear. Yeah. And they didn't succumb to that temptation. I don't think too much. It actually is, it's an ever-present threat in a psychological sense, but we don't see all that much of it. And I think they handled that well.
Yeah, you don't see it pretty much at all for the first 4 episodes.
Yeah. And can I ask a question about magic? Sorry.
Wait. I want to ask Sam, though. Sam, you said that that the Tunnbach is getting sick because it's eating the corrupted white interlopers. And could you just talk about what actually is in the show that communicated that to you?
Well, I mean, so it's definitely deteriorating as it goes on, and I actually don't believe that they were. It keeps running into them, and they do score some pretty solid hits on it, but I don't buy that it can be so easily diminished by their attacks. I think that, I just sort of think there's this. I loved it as a villain, as a monster, as this force that is, they don't belong there. They have to be destroyed. And they're being punished for their sort of imperialist arrogance. I'm all about punish characters for imperialist arrogance. But so it's by the end, when we see it sort of, it's so diminished and so sick, even before it eats them because they are physically poisoned, that I sort of felt like it was a bigger picture, that the physical poisoning that Good Sir does to them, in the end is, sort of making the metaphor really, actual, for what's been happening to the monster the whole time. Like, they can't kill it any other way than their own toxic selves.
Yeah.
Actually, one interesting, when I was doing historical research, they said that the guns that they had were not well suited for this environment, and that some guy who went looking for Franklin's expedition actually found a polar bear with shots they had fired at it lodged in its skin, so that they could just shoot bullets, at the bear, and it wouldn't even penetrate the skin into the muscle, let alone kill it, because their guns were just crap.
They would have been balls back in that day, right? Like, they wouldn't have had the tapered edge of a bullet. Yeah.
One thing I was just going to ask, so one thing that did confuse me a little bit is the show occasionally deployed visions, and we were always led to believe the few times it did that these were the visions of dying people or people, who were going crazy, except at the very first or second episode when Mr. Collins, who I think is the guy who gets lowered down in the diving suit to dislodge the ice from the propeller, he sees this vision of like a person or a monster-ish person swimming towards him underwater.
No, it was the guy who drowned, the guy who fell off the mast.
Oh, it's the guy who fell off the mast and drowned. Okay. Well,
no, I don't think so. Sorry, I think it was Mr. Collins, and I think he talks about it toward the end.
Does he?
Another one of my criticisms. So yes, in the early episodes,
Mr. Collins was the guy in the diving suit.
Yes, and he talks about the vision he had toward the end of the show.
But what does he say the vision was? Because we're led to assume that there's some reality to it until we realize he's crazy later, because everyone else who has a vision is on the brink of death and dying.
This is a bit the thing. Like, I'm not, in general, I kind of appreciate that ethos of you're never really sure if it's real or imagined. And, you could have even gone that route with the Tumbak to some extent. Is it really there? But I think, again, this was an underexplained kind of aspect of it. And one of the things, I think it was you, Grady, who said at the beginning about the end of the book being all woo-woo mystical. I actually found the end of the show a little bit woo-woo mystical. They went for some very long, brooding, arty shots of the various characters dying. They died for like 45, 50 seconds of screen time, and they all had some kind of weird vision that made no fucking sense. You were just like, okay, all right, wait. This is a different show. What just happened?
Totally. For me, that was actually how I, in arguing about this with my husband, that was how I rationalized Hickey knowing what to do with the Tumbak, because throughout the show in the final episodes, we see characters having these visions because they're close to death, or because they're terrified, or because they've otherwise started to sort of breach the sort of wall they built as Western imperialists around themselves and the natural/spiritual world. So, like, my number one crush of the show, Mr. Tozer, sees the Tumbak rip somebody's soul out, and lives to tell about it. And so I thought that Hickey's sort of, whatever he does in the end is sort of, he was able to see things and understand things because he could see the spirit world or the world of the Tumbak more clearly, as he's dying. But yeah, I definitely agree with Aaron that there were a lot of, things that were way underexplained, and it was a big, problem I had with the show.
Well, yeah, let me just, because, I think that in the podcast that Aaron's referencing, it's called The Minds Behind the Terror podcast, if anyone wants to go listen to it. I think it's really interesting. But yeah, they talk about how complicated the show is. And one of the guys says, I think there's 55 named characters in this show, to give you an idea of how much stuff there is to sort out. And and they just mentioned things happening in the show where I was just like, wow, I don't remember that happening. And I actually went back and I was able to watch the first 5 episodes a second time. And there were so many things where I saw what they had been referring to, and I was just like, wow, I can't imagine how anyone
caught that the first time around. Yeah, this is one of the few shows.
For an example, I mean, one of our first introductions to Mr. Hickey is he jumps down into a grave and steals the ring off the corpse.
But do you actually see that?
No, you just see him, like, it cuts back to him, and he sort of like has his hand in his pocket and sort of pulls it out. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone caught that the first time, I would be amazed.
Yeah,
I did actually.
I'm amazed.
But now that you're saying that's Hickey, I had no idea that was Hickey because I didn't know who the hell Hickey was when I was watching that episode, and I didn't remember that was him.
I remembered that it was Hickey, but I didn't remember any discussion of the ring before that. And I certainly didn't remember, like, when he, and I listened to that same episode of the podcast, Dave, that you're referring to, when he jumps down into the grave, I took that for a gesture of decency. One of many, incidentally, that he makes. And one of the things that is good about this villain, and even though we subsequently find out it wasn't a gesture of decency at all, but we didn't really subsequently find that out. So this is another one. Like, I'm pretty good about this, about picking up little things and remembering them later. But when Good Sir finds the ring and he recognizes it, I was like, why does he know what that is? I totally spaced on that completely. It did not land for me at all. And I can see the actor's face and all this emotion on his face. I'm like, this is supposed to mean something to us, y'all. But I did not remember what it was at all. But what I was going to say is that those who are faithful listeners of the show will perhaps have heard me say on a number of occasions that I typically watch these things with my husband. And the two things that make him bail out are overcomplicated narratives and not being able to tell anyone apart. And this ticks both of those boxes, but he didn't bail. He loved it. So even though he's still, there was a lot of pausing, what's happening right now? Who is that guy? He stuck with it to the end and still loved it. And when I was talking to him about being on the show and I was like, I'm going to, point out this flaw and that flaw, he's like, okay, but it was a really good show. He did not want me to criticize the show.
Well, and for all we've said about Mr. Hickey, let me just say that actor was fucking amazing.
Wasn't he great? He was great.
And it was interesting in listening to the creators talk about it, where they said every other actor who came in to read for that part read him like the fangs were out, like he was a villain, and that actor came in and was smiling through the whole thing. And they're like, "Oh, this is our guy," because he just has that effortless charisma, where you almost think he's a hero or the hero for the first couple episodes.
And he sure does.
If you're missing stuff, like I was.
Yeah.
And he sure does think he's the hero, and he's a straight up psychopath. I loved it.
Well, that's one of those things, I really, really had a hard time with this show for the first few episodes. I'm a big sucker for history, especially 19th century, and I appreciated all the ways they did the history without overselling it or overcooking it. But it wasn't for me until probably the 5th episode where Crozier decides to get sober and Mr. Blanky, who's my man crush in this, loses his leg. To me, this
was pretty awesome.
Yeah, and to me, I felt like those first few episodes, I was like, oh, this is just another show. Well, not another. I mean, there aren't that many. This is a show that's going to be about these like dudes, and they're doing something dumb, and look what assholes they are, and blah blah blah. And then, and the person I liked the most in those opening episodes was Sir John Franklin, because as many bad mistakes as he made, he was also the guy who's like, we have to put a positive face on this. We can't walk around and get drunk and say we're all going to die. We're going to sing songs. We're going to have a church service. We're going to make we're going to bring freaking costumes in a trunk to have a costume party. And it wasn't until Crozier gets sober, that I realize that this fits into my favorite genre out there, which is the same genre as the movie Gravity, the George Clooney, Sandra Bullock thing, which is good people trying to survive in a really horrible situation that is a crucible for their character. And there doesn't have to be a bad guy, even though in this there are some. But I'm not sure Hickey's as much a bad guy as he is someone whose mind sort of goes, and the worst parts of his character come out in really excruciating and extenuating circumstances. I mean, the Tunbach's kind of a dick. But to me, this became a show about decency and people trying to do the right thing and trying to be smart and trying to solve problems. And that's what I loved about the second half of this series.
Let me just say, Grady, about Franklin. It's interesting Sir John Franklin, going back and watching the first couple episodes again. Literally everything he does in every scene is as misguided as it could possibly be.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But you can tell that he genuinely loves and cares about his men, which makes him very sympathetic and gives you not what your typical impression of a character like that would be.
Yeah, he comes and tries to bury sympathetic. Well, he comes and tries to bury the hatchet with Crozier, and Crozier's too drunk and jerky to do it.
Well, but Crozier's also right. Sorry.
Yeah, but Crozier's also wrong in the sense of Crozier's right, but he's not a good captain. It's not until he gets sober that he's right and a good captain, and by then being right, sort of academic.
No, I disagree. I thought Franklin was a terrible captain, as evidenced by the fact that he makes every decision wrong and doesn't want to send a party to ask for help because that would be defeatism. He does everything wrong. The show, for me, as I said, they had me at monster, but it really took off when we see him die in episode 3. It's this amazing, amazing death they give him.
Yeah.
So he, to me, sort of embodies the sort of, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, anti-everybody, British imperialist mindset in a way that was really horrific. And that Ciarán Hinds is a skilled enough actor to make that compelling and entertaining, and he doesn't feel like a villain. He feels like a jolly good dude. We find out later, as my friend Liz reminded me, that when they were tugging the sledge on a previous expedition, he rode in the sledge instead of helping to carry it. Pretty villainous in a cheerful, happy, kind of good old boy way.
I didn't read him as a villain, but I definitely didn't read him all that sympathetically. I think that all the decisions he made were ultimately in service to his vanity. And although I did not doubt the sincerity of his love for his men, it was nevertheless eclipsed by his love for himself and his need to redeem himself for whatever happened in Van Diemen's Land, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Tasmania?
Yeah.
Whatever previous posting he had, and he needed to cover himself in glory. And so all of the decisions he made were, I think he was intellectually aware that Crozier was right, that if they did not leave now, there was a great chance they were going to get frozen in the ice and all of their lives would be put at risk. But he needed to roll the dice because he desperately needed it to work. But to go back to something Sam said, one of the things I think this show did really well, when survival horror works the best, it's a study of how civilization and morals either break down or at least come to light or are shown in their most primordial states under these kinds of survival pressures. And to have that play out, you could not start with a more regimented, hierarchical, orderly, very definition of order, a more orderly environment than a British naval ship in 1845. So you start out with the Rubik's Cube is tight. Everything is perfectly regimented, and slowly under this inexorable glacier that is the Arctic grinding them to dust, you see their true selves emerge and how each of them copes with that. And I think the show did that very well.
What Sam was saying about the actor who plays Sir John Franklin, I just want to note that I thought every actor pretty much in this was fantastic.
Fantastic.
But it was funny because every actor who shows up on screen, I'm like, oh, I know that guy from so-and-so. He's a great actor.
Yeah.
I have no idea what his name is, but I know he's a good actor.
But it was great to see Caesar and Brutus together again, playing essentially the same characters.
And I'm going to say, I thought everyone was freaking great on this show, but Jared Harris, who plays Crozier,
knocked it out of the park.
Oh my God, he was amazing. And he's made this thing about playing daddies. You know, everyone wants Lane Price to be their daddy. Everyone wants, you know, he plays Queen Elizabeth's daddy in The Crown. Like, he's the good daddy.
Well,
except on Fringe when he was a really awesome villain.
And
I
The
never saw
Expanse. He's not great in The Expanse,
that's
right?
Oh, I didn't realize he was in The Expanse. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, The Expanse.
Over to you, Dave.
Great show, by the way. But no, I want to mention, too, though, we haven't mentioned that there's sort of this subplot where Franklin's wife and niece right, are back in London trying to drum up support for a rescue party. And I thought that was interesting. I thought, it was Charles Dickens makes an appearance. And one thing I noticed rewatching it is there was so after I'm sure Grady knows this, but after the expedition was lost, these rescue parties went looking and heard from the Inuits that some of the people had resorted to cannibalism. And when these accounts came back to London, people just couldn't believe that, British naval people would do that. And so started saying, oh, well, the Inuits must have massacred them. And Charles Dickens actually said, we believe every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel. And they actually put those words into the mouth of Fitzjames in this show. It's taken directly from this op-ed or something written by Charles Dickens.
And actually, the one thing they did get wrong with that, because I always find it kind of heartbreaking that Dickens, he just couldn't believe a British person would be reduced to this. And they found remains with tool marks on the bones, I think, since then, that pretty much confirmed that people were eating people towards the end. But Lady Jane really wasn't the only person looking. The Admiralty actually offered, I think, a £2 million reward for the rescue of Sir John Franklin almost from the beginning of year 3. And I think it was like £1 million just for information about his whereabouts. So even though she really undertook a huge labor to fund private vessels and raise money to send search parties, the Admiralty wasn't just sitting around twiddling its thumbs either.
Well, actually, speaking of people eating people, I will say one of my other minor criticisms of this show is that I'm pretty squeamish when it comes to gross out kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And this got too gross. The last couple episodes definitely got too gross for me. I had to kind of put my hand up in front of the screen. In
the early episodes, when there's all these scenes of the officers eating dinner and there's lingering close-ups of the cutlery and the nice plates, and I'm like, you're going to be eating people.
Well, and I love that they take the plate settings with them and they're eating human meat off of them.
Yep.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the interesting historical facets. I'm sure, again, Grady, you could say, but they took, again, and I guess this came up in the podcast that Aaron mentioned, but they took what was it, like cutlery and china and curtain rods and 900 pounds of chocolate that they never ended up eating, and there's just sort of weird stuff like that.
It was weird, but I have to say they eventually were vindicated in the choice of cutlery because Blanky decides to wrap himself in forks in what is undeniably the best, for me anyway, absolutely the best scene, where he's sitting there wrapped in supper forks, waiting for the creature to eat him, and he's like, "Where have you been, you bastard?"
And he previously had asked for 50 forks, and I was like, "Oh, he's lost his mind."
I thought so too.
He actually does have a plan.
Crozier's like, "Forks."
That's why I love Blanky.
Blanky was awesome.
Just to throw in another quick historical thing. So one thing the show never talks about is when the guys abandon the Terror and go out on their quest where they ultimately all die, they leave behind about 8 or 12 people on the Terror. Yeah. And in the show, we never find out what happened to them. And they actually found the remains of the Terror a few years ago it was sunk, but it was almost perfectly preserved. And and it was way, way off course. So the ice had actually melted and lit it free. And actually, it looks like until the point where it sunk, the people who were on it were actually not only surviving, but surviving very well and actually making a good attempt with a small crew to sail their way to safety.
It's interesting, just as a sidebar, sailors are notoriously superstitious. I found these ship names, both of them, very odd choices for ships. And understanding that, their backstory is warships. Terror does not sound like a ship I would want to sail on. And Erebus is like part of the Greek underworld, if memory serves. It's that these are, if you're a superstitious
because they're unleashing hell on their enemies, right? Isn't that the idea?
Well, it's also pretty badass, right? Like, who wants to be firing bombs at a bunch of stupid Americans from something named like the Guinevere? You want to be on I'm on the frickin' Terror. Like, my leather jacket says Terror on the back.
Look at me shiny buttons.
Sam, were you going to say something?
Just, they're wreaking hell on their enemies until they come up against, real terror in the form of a monster.
Yeah, I mean, if Dan Simmons couldn't have written a book with the title The Terror unless it had had a cool name like that. I mean, if it was like the Guinevere, nobody would ever write a supernatural horror story about that.
It definitely wouldn't sound as macho.
Isn't that what's important?
I think it is.
Wait, so Grady, while we're on the subject, what is there anything else to add about recent? You said there have been a bunch of recent discoveries that have kind of falsified.
Well, the biggest, well, not the biggest, but the one I think is sort of the outstanding one is, so most current research thinks that lead poisoning had nothing to do with any of this. Yes, there was a cut rate supplier who got the contract for the cans and really screwed them up, because in the show, they make a big deal that the cut rate supplier supplies all these cans where the lead solder has run into the food and contaminated it, and they're all getting lead poisoning and going loopy. But most researchers now think that the high rates of lead in the remains, in the bodies and the remains they found, were pretty much because that was just the high rate of lead in the environment back in the day. And that what probably had, and they felt like there was no way the amount of lead that was from those cans that was leaching into the food was in high enough quantities or concentration, even in 3 years, to have had any kind of massive effect on people's health. What they think was more likely is that zinc poisoning from a lack of eating meat weakened everyone's immune systems to the point where when tuberculosis broke out and some other infections and diseases, they just raced through people like corn through a goose.
Yeah, I mean, and that resonates. I am not at all a doctor, but in my previous life was an aid worker, and what you tend to see in refugee situations or in situations where you have displaced populations or populations that are suffering from malnutrition. The malnutrition is basically the thing that weakens everybody, and then you get some sort of acute respiratory infection, and the combination of those two, or some other communicable disease. That the combination of those two is absolutely devastating.
I thought weren't they eating salt pork? I thought their whole diet was like salt pork or something like that. Does that not
salt beef? Oh yeah, salt beef. I mean, that was what most of the British Navy ate: Irish salt beef.
But, they also talked a lot about scurvy. And although it seems like this took place at a time when they had already understood the connection between citrus and warding off scurvy, they made some remark in the show, which, I don't know anything about. But they made some remark in the show to the effect that after a certain period of time, even the lemon juice that they're carrying to ward off scurvy loses its vitamin C or whatever it is that's warding off the scurvy. So, whether it was zinc or whether it was vitamin C or whatever the nutritional deficiency was, it just seems to me intuitively that that's a very likely explanation for how your immune system gets to a point where just about any opportunistic infection can sort you out really fast. And in those, of course, cramped conditions, it just spreads like wildfire.
But yeah, it was funny though that the supplier of their canned goods was apparently 2 years after the fact was found guilty of fraud or something, and it was really, really bad. Like apparently there were cases where he had just put rocks in the cans. I mean, it was like out of control.
Well, and one thing they don't talk about this, but you just mentioned it a second ago, Dave, was this idea that, most of what the British Navy was like, if you want to think of like the fuel of the British Navy, if these ships are rocket ships, what the fuel is not like liquid oxygen. The fuel is the food that's feeding the men. And most of it was beef from Ireland that was heavily salted and canned. And that beef in Ireland and the production of that beef in Ireland is what caused the Irish potato famine, which was raging in its worst years during the John Franklin expeditions. So, the beef that powers this Navy on this quixotic quest to wind up finding a passage that no one ever even sailed through the Northwest Passage without an icebreaker in front of them until like 2008. It was a useless passage. But what fueled it was basically wiping out hundreds of thousands of people in Ireland through famine.
Sorry, what was the link between the beef and the blight?
Oh, okay. So what happened was in Ireland, as British landlords took over the common lands and things and made more and more farmland, grazing land, the potatoes became more and more the number one crop in Ireland because a lot of the grazing land and the common land and everything, all that was getting exported. And it made Ireland more and more dependent on potatoes, and it made it more and more this main staple of the diet. So when the blight broke out and everything, that there wasn't anything else to fall back on. Everything they grew, or a large part of what they grew, was beef for export to the British Navy. It wasn't the sole cause, but it was a definite contributing factor.
It boggles, though, doesn't it? And they actually list at certain points in the show, it boggles the mind to think about the stores and the rations that they must have had to bring with them for any voyage, but let alone, I mean, they're frozen in this ice for, 3 or 4 years or something like this. And just the fact that they're steamships, first and foremost. They have steadying sails and they can run under sail if they need to, but they're first and foremost steamships, which means that they're coal powered. And just the concept, first of all, the concept of having a coal-fired boiler in the belly of your ship, what could go wrong? But anyway, so just like trying to get your head around the mountains of coal and the weight of that, let alone the food stores and the water and the lemon juice. And
that's something they never talk about is fresh water. Like, think of how much fresh water they needed on these trips.
I think once they got there was a lot.
So I actually wrote this down. They had 32,000 pounds of salt beef, 36,000 pounds of biscuit, 3,600 gallons of concentrated spirits, and almost 5,000 gallons of ale and porter. If you're wondering how much...
Jesus, 32,000 pounds of salt beef.
And how did they control the vermin? Like, I know they had the cats, but, with all due respect to our feline friends, there's only so much they can do. And some cats will eat cockroaches. But, I mean, I just can't imagine the amount of vermin that there must have been in that hold.
There's a lot of talk in the book about the rat situation and also the supplies situation and how, as you use up the coal, you're disrupting the balance of the ship.
Right.
And all that. So you should definitely read the book because they really goes deep on that stuff.
See, I want to get Sam back in here. Sam, is there anything else just about the show at all that you, any other thoughts you had that you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, I think that I found it really surprising, and I thought the storyline was really good, and I thought it was scary, and I liked the way it kept subverting expectations, and, I'm always, excited for a good anti-imperialist narrative in a mainstream show. So, I don't have a ton to add.
You said you watched it with your husband?
Yes.
Like, what kind of stuff did you guys talk about or whatever while you were watching it?
It was a lot like Aaron, a lot of pausing and like, wait, what? Wait, I think this is what happened. And wait, and also my husband was really annoyed with me because every single episode I had to watch with subtitles because I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I did
I don't
too.
know if it's my punk rock days, if I'm going deaf, but, I didn't know what anybody was saying. And he was having no problem, but I needed the subtitles on.
Oh, really? Yeah, I definitely, because you have the accents and then you have just the historical weirdness and then just the British idioms and all that stuff
all
together.
All those things together.
I was subtitling it all the way.
We subtitled it also, and we blame it on, we got a new sound system and the speaker just, the dialogue gets drowned. But I suspect we might have done it anyway. But I mean, I'm not a Brit. I like to think I have a fairly sensitive ear for accents, but boy, Jared Harris crushes them. I have heard so many different accents from that guy, and they all sound perfect. I don't know what his real accent is, but whatever. He's probably
from Oklahoma.
Yeah, that was another level of meaning. Like, there was a lot of this show that I just had to be like, okay, I'm going to let this wash over me. I know I'm missing a lot. And I know that there was probably so much narrative being conveyed in the different men's accents and like what it revealed about their class and geographic origins. And I just felt totally unequipped. Part of my greater sort of like, which white guy is this problem was, the accents were probably conveying information I was not prepared to receive.
Well, and that's fair enough. Like, a lot of the characters definitely had northern accents, though, and between that and all the snow and the music, which I think they did this on purpose, there was a lot of Game of Thrones vibes going on there, where I just felt like we were in the north. I was expecting to see dire wolves at any moment.
Jon Snow up on the prow.
That would have been
brooding.
Awesome. Brooding. With his one Jon Snow face.
That's probably
one face.
That's probably who Colin saw underwater in his vision early on.
Tunnbach has glowing blue eyes.
Somebody mentioned earlier that this I now don't remember what it was, but that this reminded them of something else. But this kind of reminded me of an Aliens movie.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it has that same
Ridley Scott.
You know, it starts out and everything seems fine and everything's under control, and then it just gets to a certain point where you're like, oh shit, they've just all control has been lost. This is
that's right. There was a Ridley Scott connection. He's an EP on this, isn't he?
That's right.
Oh, I forgot about that.
I mean, this is 19th century Alien with an angry polar bear instead of a xenomorph.
It would have been great if somebody had just had that moment at the table with the lead poisoning where even if something didn't burst out of their chest, maybe they just had a puke right at the end.
But, the thing I just want to say, one of the things I really loved about this also was that as things devolved, towards the end and they set off from the Terror and abandoned it, I feel like, and of course I'm probably wrong and history's had its day, but you just had this feeling that if people had just stuck with Crozier, because Crozier really became this character who believed in the system. And the system was going to work. And it was what was going to take care of them if they invested in it. And he was right as they left the ship. I mean, granted, the system's what got them into the trouble in the first place. But as they moved out into, on their sleds trying to look for safety, if they just stuck with Crozier was down with rule of law. He wasn't just going to kill someone. He was going to have a trial and execute them. He wasn't just going to take someone's word for it because they were British. He was actually going to use reason and logic to investigate what was going on. He was actually, he believed in letting the men take all this puffery stuff, these china and these curtains and everything, because he knew they'd leave them later and it made them feel good. There was something I really loved about the fact that Crozier sort of leaned into the structure and the hierarchy, and it's what was saving them.
And he bothered to learn the Netsilik language.
Yeah.
And he had respect for them and the fact that they, his mentality towards the Inuit was really different from Sir John's.
Right, exactly.
Well, and you think if just Mr. Hickey had not been on that ship, how much differently might things have gone?
Well, I mean, one of the things I love that Crozier does later, and it's such a tragedy when no one listens to him, is even though it's not the right or most expedient or the smartest thing to do, we aren't leaving anyone behind. He insists. And so when you get to that later scene after he's taken captive and the group has just decided to abandon the sick people and this train behind them, you can see everything falling apart. And Crozier's thing is we have to keep it all together. We're stronger together. I think I heard that a few years ago somewhere, like a slogan or something. But I love the fact that you have Hickey who's telling everyone what they want to hear and all this stuff. He's just talking whatever bullshit will sort of get him what he wants and scratch his itch, and he's saying what they want to hear. And you have Crozier Crozier, who's like, we've got systems, we've got laws, we've got ways, we've got morals and values, and we're going to stick with those. And when we fail, those will carry us.
I think, too, my own take on it was that some of that changed over the course of the show, and some of it was him kind of learning from the example of Sir John, because early in the show, Crozier's very much about, this is the pragmatic thing to do. This is what we need to tell the men. This is the situation in all its ugliness. And Sir John was much more about, I mean, this is the guy who brought Carnival masks. He was much more about morale. He was much more about brotherly love. He was much more about, you have to understand the importance of morale. You have to understand the importance of image. You have to understand the importance of maintaining a positive attitude in the face of strife. And Crozier seemed to me at the beginning to be less receptive to that sort of idea. And as he becomes more seasoned with having those responsibilities on his shoulders and his alone, he comes to kind of embrace that and see it much more clearly. And I think that resonates with, certainly resonates with me and probably anybody who's been in a professional environment or even a personal environment, I guess, where you're making that transition from middle management where you know what's up, and you're taking a very pragmatic view of everything, and the more seasoned leader is like, slow your roll. That's all important, but some of these symbolic things are important too, and a good leader understands that. The more experience you have, the more you come to recognize that what at first came across as superficial or fluffy or naive even is not that at all. It's understanding the power of symbol. It's understanding the power of your mental outlook and how that plays into all of it. So I felt like that was one of the things in Crozier's character arc that did develop over the course of the series.
And I think you're right. That's something he learned from Franklin.
I feel like the other big transition with him is that he starts the show as a man who's been totally poisoned by the frustrations and bitterness of, like, because of who he is. He can only advance so far. He'll always be at best a second. And he can't marry the woman he loves, and he'll be looked at contemptuously by by Sir John and others in the sort of Admiralty, because he's Irish and a Catholic. And so he's sort of settled into this, like, I'm going to do my job, I'm going to drink a shit ton, I'm going to be a highly functioning alcoholic, and it's only when he is forced to by leadership to sober up that he sort of transforms. And I actually feel like the transformation that he makes is in opposition to Franklin, because Franklin is a man consumed with the idea of glory, and winning this thing for himself. And if for him keeping morale high is a priority, it's less because of, he cares about the men's feelings than because that's what's going to get him home safe and triumphant. Remember, he didn't help carry the sledge.
Damn, that really stuck with you, man.
Yeah, man. I'm not bitter. So, I think that the thing that I love about who Crozier becomes is he becomes somebody whose only priority is the lives of his men. And he's going to sacrifice himself to the cannibal savage, traitor Hickey, to save his men. And he's going to do whatever he needs to do, because for him, the only priority and what leadership means to him is the well-being and lives of his men.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about his transformation is there's a part of it also that comes from, because I think he gets part of that from Franklin, but part of it also from Jobson, who isn't Jobson someone who sticks by him and sort of nurses him through and talks about his mother being an alcoholic. And there's something, and it's like, it's interesting to see him being changed by what's around him. And I wonder if at the end, and I've really thought about this, and I think it is his biggest shame for Crozier is what Hickey puts his finger on when he's about to be hung and says last words, is that he was going to abandon ship and go, even though it was the pragmatic solution, even though it was the smart solution, even though he thought he was making that decision for all the right reasons so no one else would get in trouble. They discover those guys 15 miles away. They never made it. It was a waste. He should have been a captain and stuck with his ship. And I think he does feel ashamed that he almost did that.
And I think it's so striking that, in that interview with the creators, they talk about how much they wanted to focus on character. And I just feel like it's just such an accomplishment that we're able to talk so much about the characters and their arcs in a story about like a demon bear killing them people off one by one, because you would, so like I feel like so many treatments of this story, the characters would all be just sort of disposable, one-dimensional ciphers.
Yeah,
that's a good point, Dave, because not only just the limitations of the genre, but also the fact that there are so many named characters, as you mentioned, and we've barely scratched the surface of some of them. I mean, Hickey, we could do a whole show on that guy. Just in terms of trying to figure out what the hell is going on there.
We haven't even talked about Good Sir.
Well, right, and so Good Sir and what's going on there. There are characters we've not touched James Fitzjames all that much, although he wasn't one of my favorites personally. But I think you're absolutely right that within the limitations of the show, and a limited series of 10 shows, they've done a tremendous job of giving us fully realized characters. Even, is it Ciaran or is it Ciaran Hinds? I don't know how to pronounce his name.
I think it's Ciaran.
And part of this is just, I think, a well-seasoned actor. One of my complaints is they offed him too quick. As much as I wasn't sad to see his character go, he's just so good in everything that he does. And so, credit to the actors too for bringing so much to the limited lines that many of them were given.
It's interesting because when this was in development, there was a period, it started out as a feature, if you can imagine trying to do this in 2 hours. And then at one point they had it as a 5-season show.
That would have been a mistake.
I agree with everything Aaron was saying about the characters and everything we've all been saying about the characters, and that doesn't contradict the fact that I still had a hard time telling many of them apart or remembering their names.
Definitely.
Even the ones whose, again, names I didn't know, I was like, oh, that guy, oh, he got ripped in half.
It didn't help that so many of them had the mutton chops, because that obscures so much of your face. So you start out with a dark-haired white guy, and this is bad enough, but then he's a dark-haired white guy with curly hair, so oh my God. And then you obscure half his face in mutton chops, and it's like, all right, I give up. This could be anyone. This could be Good Sir. This could be, what's his name? It starts with an M. Magnus, whatever his name is. This could be Collins. This could be, I just give up, man.
But see, that's why you have to watch the show twice, because on second viewing, everything is, clear. And
especially if you get it in HD.
All the character stuff is clear, and it's worth it. It's definitely worth it watching it again.
Well, and that's, and it's sort of one of the things I've realized sort of writing stuff is all that matters is having characters people want to watch. That's what kept me watching for, these 5 early episodes, and probably why I didn't like it until the 5th, because it took me that long to tell people apart and sort of get who is going where and to see them go from point A to at least point 8.5. But that's what, you're right, that's what dragged me through this show is the characters. They're really, the Tunnbach was fine, I guess, but I really was there for these dudes.
And almost it didn't need the Tunnbach. It almost didn't need the Tunnbach. There was so much kind of a horror in it anyway, just the sheer challenges of the environment and the situation in which they found themselves, and all these people in close quarters. And I do think it's a slow burn. There's not a lot that happens, but it rewards that patience in the end.
We've barely talked about Lady Silence, who was an amazing character, and I thought they did a ton of great stuff. Although, I share the critique Aaron raised about this sort of mystical Aboriginal figure being a trope that's often that's used way too much and used poorly, and this could have been done better. But I loved her. I loved her scenes.
It's worth noting, too, that they hired all Inuit actors who were native speakers, I believe, of Netsilik. So, I mean, they were, making pretty serious efforts to...
Yeah.
They were, and they made it clear on that podcast that this is an issue that they were sensitive to. And I think, again, some of it's down to the limitations of the source material, but I think Lady Silence was a great character. And if anything, she was underexplored, and that it could have mitigated against that issue. I think that there's an aspect of tokenism, that, not in this show, just in general, that when you're of necessity flirting with a trope that could be considered problematic, that the extent to which you only explore that character in a very limited or superficial way exacerbates that issue. And so the more that you can put that character in context and give them a backstory and give them motivations that are clear, and I think that's my biggest criticism of Lady Silence is she is, even before she's silent, largely inscrutable in terms of what are her motivations. We get that she's a good person. We get that through the actions that she undertakes, particularly toward the end. But we don't really know what she's trying to achieve here. And as a result of that, it comes across as being a little more two-dimensional than you would like.
Okay, so we need to start wrapping this up. I just want to note that this show, for all of its sort of slow and historical and character focused, has been quite popular. I was reading that it's the best rated show on AMC after the 2 Walking Dead shows and Better Call Saul.
Oh.
And so given that, you would expect it to maybe come back for a season 2. I mean, obviously it would be a different storyline. And I think the showrunners are not planning to return because they just said they're just like, this was such a big scale to do this that they want to do something smaller.
I don't know. You make them all zombies and then it rolls right into the Walking Dead franchise.
But
this is a prequel.
Writers of Walking Dead, take notes. This is how you do this shit right. I mean, minus zombies, obviously.
But yeah, I know Aaron has to go, and yeah, we should start wrapping this up. Does anyone have any final thoughts they want to throw in before we go?
I'll throw out one. I overall really, really liked the show, and I am glad to see this tendency, at least I think it's a tendency lately, towards limited run shows that aren't feature film length, but they're also not multiple seasons. I like this format of 8 episodes or 10 episodes that gives you an opportunity to delve a little bit more into the story without dragging it out and throwing in a bunch of extra bells and whistles that the story doesn't really need. So, kudos to AMC for picking this up and finding the format that works. And I would love to see more of that type of treatment of some of our favorite works of fiction.
Yeah, my husband says it's like a 10-hour film. These limited series, they have the sort of sweep and scope and often budget of cinema, and that really enables you to tell like amazing stories and explore amazing characters with awesome visuals and really great writing and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, and I'm just going to reiterate what you guys are saying. Ditto. Because I do think having an ending gives the rest of it meaning. And it's what manga's been doing for years, I mean, these stories may run 60 or 100 volumes, but there's an ending in sight. And I think it really gives the whole series a lot more weight and makes it a lot more satisfying to know that this is ending. It's going somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Aaron was saying, credit to AMC for greenlighting this show. I mean, I'm sure the budget was huge, and it's a sort of odd, supernatural, Arctic historical thing. I'm sure, that they're obviously like aiming to do something different, and it's ambitious, and just the whole thing I think is really well done. So if you haven't watched it, I would say go watch it. I think it's pretty cool. And yeah, but I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Grady Hendrix, Aaron Lindsay, and Sam J. Miller. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you later.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Grady Hendrix, Aaron Lindsay, and Sam J. Miller for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Arturo Sanchez, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Arthur Brown, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.